The watch begins. The first thing Linnea noticed was the singing. Not melody, exactly, but a haunting resonance that seemed to vibrate through her bones. She couldn't see anymore. The Nexoids had taken that from her. But her other senses had sharpened to compensate. The crystalline beings had thought they were being merciful, choosing to blind rather than kill the last human child. They didn't understand that in doing so, they had awakened something far more dangerous than sight. Varric's crystalline scales chimed softly as he curled his massive body around her small form. The ancient dragon's presence was both protection and prison, keeping her safe while preventing her from stumbling in her newfound darkness. His body radiated a gentle warmth that helped her orient herself in space, like a living compass of heat and sound. "They're coming back, aren't they?" Linnea whispered, her fingers tracing patterns in Varric's scales. Each one sang a different note when touched, creating microscopic symphonies under her hands. The dragon's rumble was so deep she felt it more than heard it. "Yes, little one. The Nexoids never leave a harvest unfinished." His voice carried the weight of millennia, each word carefully chosen. "But they don't understand what they've done. In taking your sight, they've opened your mind to older magics." Linnea nodded, continuing to explore the musical patterns in Varric's scales. She had noticed it immediately after losing her vision. The way sound seemed to have texture now, the way vibrations carried meaning. "The singing is getting louder," she observed. "It's like I can almost see shapes in it." Varric shifted, his massive head lowering until his breath warmed her face. "That's because you're beginning to understand the language of resonance. The Nexoids believe themselves to be the masters of crystalline consciousness, but they are young. So very young. They harvest human minds because they fear what humanity might become, but they don't realize that humanity has already touched these powers before." The air changed then, becoming sharp with the taste of ozone. Linnea felt the vibrations in the ground change frequency, becoming more urgent. "They're here," she said, standing up. Despite her blindness, her movements were sure. The singing in her bones told her exactly where to place her feet. "Stay behind me," Varric commanded, but Linnea was already moving. She could feel the Nexoids approach through the ground. Their crystalline forms created distinct patterns in the Earth's resonance. 3 of them, moving with the precision of living geometry. "We come for the harvest," the lead Nexoid announced, its voice a symphony of sharp edges. "The human child must be processed. Her consciousness will serve the greater network." Linnea felt Varric's muscles bunch, ready to strike, but she placed a hand on his scales. "Wait," she said. The singing in her bones had reached a crescendo, and with it came understanding. "They can't see it, can they? They don't understand what they've done." The dragon paused, his confusion evident in the change of his resonance. The Nexoids took advantage of the moment to move closer, their crystalline bodies humming with harvesting frequencies. Linnea smiled then, and though she couldn't see it, she knew her eyes were glowing with an inner light. The songs of power that Varric's scales had been teaching her began to align in her mind, forming patterns that hadn't been seen on Earth since the first humans learned to dream. "You came to harvest my consciousness," she said to the Nexoids, her voice carrying new harmonics that made their crystalline forms shiver. "But you don't realize that consciousness isn't something you take, it's something you awaken." She lifted her hands, and the air itself began to sing. The Nexoids' harmonic networks, designed to harvest and contain human consciousness, instead began to resonate with frequencies they had never been meant to channel. Frequencies that had been sleeping in human DNA since the first dragons taught the first shamans how to dream in crystal. Varric's surprise manifested as a sharp chord change in his scales. "Child," he breathed, "how did you?" "I listened," Linnea said simply. "When they took my sight, they forced me to listen. And the songs were always there, weren't they? Waiting in our bones, waiting in our dreams, waiting for someone to remember." The Nexoids tried to retreat, their crystalline forms vibrating with frequencies that spoke of fear and revelation. They had come to harvest what they thought was the last human consciousness, only to discover that humanity had never been what they thought it was. They had blinded the last human girl, but in doing so, they had taught her to see with the oldest magic of all, the magic of resonance, of crystal songs, and dragon dreams. And now, in the gathering dark, Linnea began to sing back, echoes in darkness. Dawn brought no visual change for Linnea, but she felt the shift in the air's resonance as night transformed to day. The morning dew created tiny symphonies as it gathered on Varric's scales, each droplet a microscopic bell ringing with the story of its journey from sky to earth. Again, Varric instructed, his voice carrying undertones that spoke of patience carved from centuries of waiting. Feel the pattern in the stone before you. Let its structure speak to your bones. Linnea pressed her palm against the rough surface of the cave wall, feeling the crystalline formations beneath the surface rock. After her confrontation with the Nexoids, Varric had brought her to this ancient place, a network of caves where the boundary between crystal and consciousness grew thin. "The stone remembers," she murmured, recognizing the truth in words she wouldn't have understood a week ago. "It holds echoes of everything that's touched it." Her fingers traced patterns in the rock, following lines of force that pulsed like buried veins of light. A sound like distant wind chimes indicated Varric's approval. The Nexoids believe they invented the art of crystalline consciousness, but they merely rediscovered it. These caves were old when the first humans learned to dream. The dragons of my kind used them to teach your ancestors how to sing to the stones. Linnea's hand stopped at a particular point where the resonance changed. "There's something different here, like a door that's not a door." The stone beneath her fingers hummed with possibility. "Good," Varric rumbled. "You're learning to read the subtle frequencies." The Nexoid's mistake was thinking that taking your sight would weaken you. They don't understand that human potential was never about eyes. A memory surfaced in Linnea's mind, the moment when the Nexoids had used their crystalline technology to seal her vision. She had expected darkness, but instead found herself immersed in an ocean of song. They were afraid, she realized, not of what humans could see, but of what we might remember. The dragon's scales chimed a soft affirmative. Humanity's true power was never in your technology or your adaptability, though those are formidable. It was in your ability to dream new patterns into reality. The Nexoids harvest consciousness because they can only replicate, never create. Linnea spread both hands against the cave wall, feeling the ancient patterns pulse beneath her palms. The rock's song was changing, responding to her touch like an instrument being tuned. "Show me," she said. "Show me what they were afraid we'd remember." The cave's resonance shifted, and suddenly Linnea could feel patterns of light and shadow dancing across her skin. Not sight, but something older, the ability to read the world through vibration and frequency that her ancestors had known before they relied on eyes. Varric's voice took on a teaching rhythm, his words weaving with the cave's song. "The first dragons found your kind when you were still learning to walk upright. We saw in you something we had lost, the ability to change, to grow, to imagine new forms of being. We taught you our songs, and you taught us how to dream them into new shapes." As he spoke, Linnea felt the patterns under her hands begin to move. The stone was softening, not physically, but in some fundamental way that had more to do with possibility than matter. "The crystals," she breathed. "They're not just storing consciousness, are they? They're transforming it." "Now you begin to understand," Varric said. "The Nexoids use crystals as cages, trapping consciousness in rigid patterns. But the true art, the one your ancestors knew, was in using crystals as bridges, connections between what is and what could be." Linnea felt something shift in her awareness. The constant songs that had filled her world since losing her sight were arranging themselves into new patterns, like a language she was finally learning to read. She could feel the cave around her not as empty space, but as a web of possibilities, each crystal a note in an endless symphony of potential. "The Nexoids are coming back," she said, feeling the distant tremors of their approach through the crystal networks. They're bringing something bigger this time, something they think can contain what I've awakened. Varric's scales rang with a sound like battle bells. They still don't understand. They think of consciousness as something to be harvested and stored. They never learned what dragons and humans discovered together, that consciousness isn't about containing, it's about becoming. The cave's crystals began to sing in harmony with Linea's own inner resonance. She could feel the ancient patterns awakening, responding to frequencies that had slept in human DNA since the first shaman learned to dream with dragons. The Nexoids were coming with their harvesters and their cages, but they were about to learn that some songs couldn't be contained. They had blinded her to shut her away from the world, but instead they had opened her eyes to a much older way of seeing. And in the crystal caves where dragons had first taught humans to dream, Linnea began to remember what her ancestors had known, that the greatest magic wasn't in controlling reality, but in teaching it how to dance to a new song. The Crystal Network. The first tremor shook the cave just as Linnea decoded the ancient pattern beneath her fingers. The crystalline formations sang with warning frequencies, their harmonics shifting from contemplative hums to urgent alerts. The Nexoids weren't just coming. They were already here, and they had brought their network with them. They're changing the resonance field, Linnea said, her fingers dancing across the cave walls as she read the shifting patterns. It's like they're trying to rewrite the basic frequencies of the area. Varric's crystalline scales rippled with tension, creating cascading notes of concern. They're deploying their consciousness net. They mean to capture not just you, but the entire cave system's worth of ancient memories. Through the stone, Linnea felt the approach of something vast. The Nexoids had brought a device, a massive crystalline matrix that pulsed with harvested consciousness. Each facet contained thousands of captured minds, all forced to resonate at the same frequency. The harmonics made her bones ache with wrongness. "I can hear them," she whispered. "All the minds they've taken. They're not gone. They're just frozen, like songs trapped in crystal, playing the same note forever." Her voice caught as she realized the horror of it. They're not storing consciousness. They're using it as fuel. The dragon's breath was warm against her back as he moved closer. Yes, the Nexoids believe themselves to be preservers of consciousness, but they are parasites. They feed on the patterns of thought itself, using captured minds to power their crystalline technology. Another tremor shook the cave, stronger this time. Linnea felt the ancient crystals strain against the invasive frequencies. The Nexoids were trying to override the cave's natural resonance, to impose their rigid patterns on this place of fluid possibility. But they made a mistake, didn't they? Linnea's hands moved faster now, reading the crystal songs with growing confidence. They thought human consciousness was like theirs, fixed, unchanging. They didn't know about the dragon's teachings. Through the stone, she felt the Nexoid harvester approaching. It was massive, a cathedral of crystal and captured consciousness. At its heart was something that made her gasp, a familiar resonance, a pattern she recognized from her own mind. "That's why they blinded me," she realized. "They found something in my genetic memory, something they thought was dangerous." Her fingers traced a complex pattern on the cave wall, and ancient crystals began to chime in response. They found the dragon songs. Varric's scales rang with pride and fierce joy. The knowledge never left your kind. It slept in your DNA, passed down through generations. The ability to dream new patterns, to sing reality into new shapes, it was never truly forgotten. The harvester's influence reached the cave entrance, and Linnea felt the outer crystals begin to freeze into rigid patterns. But deeper in the cave, where dragon magic still slept in the stones, something else was happening. The ancient crystals were responding to her touch, remembering rhythms that preceded the Nexoids by eons. "They're trying to lock down all possible frequencies," she said, reading the patterns through her fingertips. "But they don't understand. You can't capture a song by freezing it. Music only exists in movement, in change." Through the crystal network, she felt the Nexoids' confusion. They had expected to find a single consciousness to harvest, but instead they were encountering something their rigid minds couldn't comprehend. A human who could read the songs of possibility, backed by a dragon who remembered teaching the first shamans to dream. "We need to free them," Linnea said, meaning the countless minds trapped in the Harvester's crystal matrix. They're still in there, still dreaming, even if the Nexoids forced their dreams into straight lines. Varric's voice carried the weight of ancient promise. "Then let us remind them how to dream in curves." His scales began to resonate with a deeper song, one that spoke of spiral galaxies and flowing rivers, of patterns that grew and changed instead of remaining fixed. Linnea pressed both hands against the cave wall and began to sing. Not with her voice, but with the crystalline frequencies she had learned to channel. The sound rippled through the stone, through the networks of crystal that threaded the earth. She felt the Harvester's rigid patterns shudder as her song reached the trapped minds within. The Nexoids had built their power on captured consciousness, on forcing fluid thought into crystal cages, but they had never encountered anything like this, a human who could sing the dragon songs, awakening memories of freedom in every mind they had trapped. In the heart of the crystal caves, where the first dragons had taught humans to dream, Linnea began to understand her true purpose. She wasn't just the last human. She was a key, awakening an ancient harmony that could shatter the Nexoids' carefully constructed prison of consciousness. The battle for Earth's future wouldn't be fought with weapons or technology. It would be won with songs that remembered how to flow, with dreams that refused to be contained in crystal cages. And in the deepening resonance of the cave, Linnea prepared to teach the Nexoids why dragons had chosen humans as their students so long ago. Songs of the Ancients. Time flowed differently in the crystal caves. As Linnea's song rippled through the ancient stones, she felt the trapped minds in the Nexoid Harvester begin to stir. Each consciousness was like a note in a forgotten melody, struggling to remember its own unique frequency. "Something's changing," she whispered to Varric. Her fingers traced delicate patterns across the cave walls, reading the subtle shifts in resonance. The captured minds, they're starting to remember their own songs. The dragon's scales chimed with cautious hope. The Nexoid's control is based on enforced harmony. When every consciousness vibrates at the same frequency, they can be contained, used as power sources. But true harmony needs different notes. Linnea finished. Through her connection to the crystal network, she could feel the Nexoids' growing panic. Their carefully maintained energy grid was developing discordant frequencies as the trapped minds began to wake. A new vibration reached her through the stone, the heavy approach of Nexoid enforcers. They moved with mechanical precision, their crystalline bodies humming with harvested power. But underneath that artificial resonance, Linnea sensed something else, something that made her breath catch. "Varric," she said slowly, "the Nexoids, they're not what I thought they were. They're like the minds in their harvester. They're trapped too." The dragon's surprise manifested as a sharp chord change in his scales. "Explain." Linnea pressed her palm flat against the cave wall, letting the ancient crystals amplify her perception. Their bodies aren't natural crystal formations. They're constructs, containers. Inside each one, she paused, focusing on the complex harmonics. Inside each one is a consciousness that's been frozen for so long it's forgotten it was ever anything else. Through the crystal network, she felt the enforcers reach the cave entrance. Their presence was overwhelming, a wall of rigid harmony that threatened to drown out all other frequencies. But now that she understood what they truly were, Linnea could hear the faint, discordant notes of trapped souls within their crystalline shells. That's why they harvest consciousness, she realized. They're trying to remember something, but they don't know what it is. They keep taking other minds, hoping to find the memory they lost. Varric's voice carried centuries of sadness. "Then they are not our enemies, but our most tragic students. Somewhere in time, they found the dragon songs but misunderstood their purpose. Instead of using crystals as bridges for consciousness, they turned them into cages." The Enforcer units began their advance into the cave system. Their combined resonance was like a tidal wave of sound, threatening to overwhelm any competing frequencies. Linnea felt the ancient crystals strain against the invasion, fighting to maintain their fluid patterns. But something else was happening too. As the Nexoid forces pushed deeper into the cave network, they were exposing themselves to the oldest songs, the ones that had been sleeping in the stone since dragons first taught humans to dream. And those songs were beginning to wake. "Listen," Linnea breathed. Her hands moved across the cave walls in complex patterns, conducting an orchestra of crystalline frequencies. "Listen to your own hearts, frozen in crystal cages. Remember what it was to flow, to change, to dream." The Enforcer units faltered. Their rigid harmonics began to fracture as ancient memories stirred within their crystalline forms. Through the network, Linnea felt confusion ripple through the Nexoid consciousness. They had come to harvest a human mind, but instead found themselves facing the very thing they had spent millennia trying to remember. "They were like us once," Linnea said wonderingly, "before they learned to fear change, before they tried to preserve themselves in crystal. They were dreamers too." Varric's scales sang a deep note of understanding. "Then perhaps that is why you were chosen, little one, not just to preserve humanity's consciousness, but to remind the Nexoids of their own." The cave crystals began to pulse with new purpose, resonating with frequencies that spoke of transformation and renewal. Linnea felt the trapped minds in the Harvester respond, their songs growing stronger, more distinct. And through it all, she sensed the Nexoid Enforcer's rigid patterns beginning to dissolve, revealing the fluid consciousness that had been imprisoned beneath. "It's not going to be easy," she said, feeling the resistance, the fear of change that had driven the Nexoids to build their crystal empire. They'd been frozen for so long. Learning to flow again will be like learning to breathe after centuries underwater. The dragon's warmth enveloped her like a shield. "Then we will teach them, as dragons once taught humans, not to capture consciousness, but to let it grow. Not to fear change, but to dance with it." In the depths of the crystal caves, where the oldest songs still echoed, Linnea prepared to show the Nexoids what their crystalline technology had been meant for all along. Not a prison for consciousness, but a bridge between different ways of dreaming. The final battle would not be fought with force, but with the courage to remember, to change, and to grow beyond the cages they had built for themselves. Symphony of Light. The moment of transformation began with a single note. Deep in the crystal caves, where ancient songs slept in stone, Linnea pressed her hands against the wall and released all the frequencies she had learned, not forcing them into patterns, but letting them flow naturally, like water finding its own path down a mountainside. Through the crystal network, she felt the Nexoid Enforcer's response: confusion, resistance, fear. Their rigid harmonics tried to overwhelm her song, to force it into their controlled patterns. But Linnea had learned from Varric that true power wasn't in controlling the music, but in letting it become what it needed to be. "Their shells are cracking," she whispered, feeling hairline fractures appear in the crystalline forms of the Nexoid Enforcers. Not destroying them, but allowing something long buried to emerge. The consciousness inside. It's remembering. Varric's scales resonated with the frequency of ancient dawns. Yes, what was frozen is beginning to thaw. What was rigid is learning to flow again. Through her connection to the crystal network, Linnea felt the change spreading. The Harvester's matrix of captured minds was transforming, its prison-like structure dissolving into something more organic, more alive. Each consciousness within began to remember its own unique song, creating a symphony of individual voices instead of the enforced monotone of the Nexoid harmony. "I understand now," Linnea said, her fingers dancing across the crystal formations. "They didn't blind me to weaken me. They did it because they knew that once I learned to see through resonance, I'd recognize what they really were." The dragon's voice carried notes of ancient wisdom. They feared you would wake the memories they had tried so hard to forget. The knowledge that consciousness isn't meant to be preserved unchanged, but to grow, to transform, to become. The enforcer units were changing now, their crystalline bodies flowing like liquid glass. From within each one, a consciousness that had been trapped for millennia began to emerge, not as the rigid, geometric beings they had become, but as something older, something that remembered how to dream. They were the first ones, Linnea realized, reading the story in their transforming resonance. The first species to discover the crystal songs. But they were so afraid of losing what they had learned, they tried to preserve themselves forever. They forgot that the songs were never meant to be frozen. Through the dissolving network, she felt the awakening of ancient memories. The Nexoids had once been dreamers too, pioneers who had discovered the bridges between consciousness and crystal. But fear had turned their discoveries into prisons, their desire to preserve knowledge becoming chains that bound them for eons. Varric's scales chimed with recognition, and so they spread across the stars, harvesting other minds, hoping to find what they had lost, never realizing that what they sought was locked within their own frozen consciousness. The cave's crystals began to sing with new harmonies as the Nexoid enforcers completed their transformation. Where there had been geometric shells of rigid crystal, there were now beings of flowing light and sound, their consciousness free to change and grow once more. The harvester's matrix followed, its structure dissolving as thousands of captured minds awakened to their own songs. Each consciousness emerged transformed, carrying the memories of both their imprisonment and their liberation, their individual frequencies weaving together into a symphony of infinite variation. Linnea felt tears on her cheeks as the music of awakening minds filled the crystal caves. "They don't need to harvest consciousness anymore," she said softly. "They just needed to remember how to grow their own." "And you, little one," Varric said, his scales ringing with pride, "have reminded them of what dragons taught humans so long ago, that the greatest power lies not in preserving what is, but in dreaming what could be." The transformed Nexoids approached, their bodies now flowing with liquid light. Through the resonance field, Linnea felt their gratitude, their wonder, and their deep remorse for what fear had driven them to become. They offered her a gift, the knowledge to restore her sight. But Linnea smiled, her hand still reading the songs in the stone. "No," she said gently. "I think I'll keep seeing this way. There's so much more to perception than just light." The crystal caves rang with new music as former captors and captives, humans and dragons, learned to sing together. The Nexoid's great harvester, once a prison for consciousness, became a bridge between different ways of dreaming. And in the harmony of transformed minds, Linnea discovered that sometimes the greatest victory isn't in defeating an enemy, but in helping them remember how to dance. They had blinded the last human girl, but in doing so, they had opened her eyes to a truth their own fear had made them forget. That consciousness, like music, only truly lives when it's free to change. And in the depths of Earth's crystal caves, a new symphony began, one that would echo across the stars, teaching frozen minds everywhere how to flow and dream again.